Welcome to our show, Global Innovation. I'm your host, Chris Graham. Our show today will explore the process of innovation in the context of how advances in technology can create new uses for older scientific discoveries. Our first guest, Dan Schell, is the president of LightMD. He joins us today to discuss how his team uses a system to deliver energy to animal cells in order to promote healing and pain management. This approach, pet light therapy, it's based on technology originally developed by NASA in the process of conducting experiments in growing plants in space. Their advances in the use of existing technology and their very hands-on approach has brought relief to thousands. So Dan's story will illustrate the idea that old ground recovered can lead to new ground discovered. Our second guest today, author Corey Brier, lives deep in the startup world. In a moment of reflection, he began to wonder why some people seem more successful than others at being innovative. What is their secrets? Do they have special routines that make them successful? Now, Corey will explain how he went about gaining insight into the minds of today's innovators, and he will share some of the tips and stories he obtained in the process. So we're going to start off with Dan, and welcome to our show today.
Hey, thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, Dan, I want to start off with a brief explanation of pet light therapy and what that all involves.
Well, it involves treating, animals from chinchillas to horses for various injuries, illnesses, but primarily musculoskeletal stuff, I suppose.
Okay, but it involves the use of light for that treatment.
Absolutely, light therapy. We are light creatures, all of us. And when we are injured or ill or even just old, unfortunately, certain things happen within the mitochondria of our cells, mitochondria being the power plant of every cell. So when you injure yourself or some sort of illness, or again, just old age, the cell starts putting out nitric oxide. And nitric oxide comes into the cell and attaches in the mitochondria and won't allow oxygen in. So what happens is the cell goes into a slow death. There's no ATP being generated, and it's unfortunately the typical front end of any kind of an injury. That happens, and it takes 4 or 5 days for the whole system to catch up and get working again. Well, when you treat an area with red and infrared light, it disassociates the nitric oxide from the cell, allows oxygen in, and then the cell can get going and do what it's supposed to do.
Okay, so you've come up with a device, you and your team, that focuses light at a particular wavelength?
Many wavelengths. That's the secret. I mean, that's why we get dramatically better success than, say, lasers. Laser, by its very definition, is one wavelength. Well, to address all the tissue types in animals or humans, you need about 350 different wavelengths. And the system we have all those wavelengths. Okay,
and so how big is the device that is used to provide these transmission of wavelengths?
It's pretty small. It's it's a tabletop unit, which has actually 2 independent outputs, so you can run, you could do 2 different things at the same time, or do different things on the same animal at the same time. So not real big. I mean, and then the pads are the magic part. That's where the LEDs are. And you were talking about how old technology could be relooked at again later and get better results, and that's really just because of technology in general. The LEDs today are much better than the LEDs were back in the 60s when NASA was working with them.
Okay, so
and we use the very high-end LEDs.
Those are light emitting
diodes,
okay.
yes.
Okay.
So they've gotten far, far superior. And then it's just how you put it all together. It's about power density to get the results that we get.
Okay, so before we started today, you were telling me about how NASA developed this science, this technology many years ago. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
They did some of the first work with it, and what they actually funded the development of LEDs out of the University of Illinois. So the idea was that they would grow plants in space, and LEDs are a great light source because they take very little power to drive, but they put out a lot of photons. So early on, when astronauts were in space, if they ever injured themselves, they didn't heal till they came back here. So when they started growing the plants and they started working with the plants and leads, suddenly they saw things start to heal. So that launched thousands of studies. I mean, the first thing they figured out they could do is carpal tunnel and just all kinds of things. They know it does. They've proven it does DNA repair, and we can get into that, but it might be a little deep. But they were really one of the first ones to really start looking at it.
And what was the inspiration for using this light transmission through LEDs? The inspiration for using it on animals?
Well, I wish I'd have had that inspiration about 16 years sooner, because I've been working on people about that long. And the reality is, if you've gone to our website, petlight.vet, you'll see the videos. And the thing about it, animals don't know what a placebo is. So there's no way denying that that dog couldn't walk and now it can, right? So, but the way I really got into it is we do a lot of work over in Dubai, Middle East. We're in several hospitals over there, and we've got a major clinic over there with one of our licensees. And I spent quite a bit of time over there, and one of the sheikhs wanted to know if we could help one of their horses. So I said, certainly, no doubt about it. And this particular horse is kind of a famous horse. His name is Fojat. Fojat.
Okay.
He's won the Dubai Mile 2 years in a row now at the World Cup. Well, about 2 months before the World Cup, they were doing some serious exercising with him, and he came back in. He was bleeding from both nose, mouth, probably a 7. It's a lung bleed. And typically, you got to go rest him for a long time. In the States, they just give them Lasix and keep going, but they can't do that over there. Thank God. They shouldn't do it here. So they asked if we could do something. I said, sure. So we worked on this horse for 6 days straight, just the lungs. And then he had a major race he had to run. He ran it, he won it, and didn't bleed. And then we worked on him all the way up into the World Cup.
Now let me stop you there. When you say you worked on him, describe the actual process of working on him using the light therapy.
Okay, well, in the case of a horse and his lungs,
sure.
His lungs run the entire length of his body, but they tend to bleed toward the back. So we put 3 pads right down the lung from the back towards the front on both sides. And we do like 40-minute treatments a day,
and
twice.
These pads have the light
leads in
emitting
them, so
diodes
the
in
leads
them. Okay.
go through the body. I mean, people have this sense that LEDs can't go very deep, only lasers can go deep. Not so, absolutely not so. So, at any rate, that's the treatment. We treat the lungs, and as I said, within 6 days, we had him ready for a major race that he won without bleeding. He hasn't bled since, at all. And then after that, we worked on him for about probably 3 weeks for the big race, and he won that, did not bleed. So.
And how did you come about deciding what frequencies to use, what type of recipes, and are
Yes.
there different recipes for different types of ailments?
Well, in the first place, the recipes for a human or a horse are the same. And it is. It's about, and that's even where NASA didn't do a lot of work, was on the frequency side of it. And we have. I mean, I researched all the way back into the early 1900s of people that had come up with notions of frequencies and the types of tissue it affected and didn't affect. And I found some that were really quite right. A guy by the name of Nogier, he was a French neurologist that figured out that human tissue resonates around the musical note D. So the different octaves of D do different things. The lower octaves are good for inflammation. Middle octaves are good for wound healing. Higher octaves are good for tendons, ligaments, muscles, stuff like that.
And those correspond to different frequencies?
Different frequencies of the different octaves of the musical note D. And then I've got a bunch of other stuff in there because I spent years just putting these frequencies together to try to get a response that I was looking for. So we've done that, and so now the machine's got 30 or 40 different recipes and the ability to make your own new recipes if you want to. It's got a custom mode in it. So as we find new things, we can keep doing it.
Okay, so you mentioned treating this horse for the lung condition.
Mhm.
Is it only for lungs, or does it also do
No,
other
no,
types of
no.
pain and distress?
Oh,
Or
absolutely. I mean, horses, I mean, and the types of horses we work on, even here, we do a lot of horses up around Woodside, all the way down to Milpitas to Gilroy, the jumpers and the dancers, the dressage horses. And the jumpers, they always have sore feet. The dancers always have sore feet. A typical kind of injury is a suspensory tear, which can be a 12 to 18 month kind of an ordeal. But we've actually taken the worst one you can do. It's a severe 4. It was a 2.5 inch rip right at the insertion point. We had the thing completely healed in 8 weeks.
wow.
And the horse going back to work. So we had all that done within 3 or 4 months, where the best anyone's ever heard about is about 9 months, and it's typically, as I said, 12 to 18. So the healing power is, it's profound. It's profound.
And for animals other than horses?
Oh, we do dogs and cats and anything.
All right, describe for me a typical treatment for a dog or a cat.
All right, our tip, I think we've gotten to be pretty well known for taking dogs that have suddenly become crippled or even have been crippled for a while and getting them back. And a typical treatment's going to be, an examination. We typically always find the back problem where it is. And I've got a really good doc that knows how to do the tissue manipulation and try to release that nerve that's stuck in there. And then the light also does the same thing. The light automatically tries to get inflammation down, and again, this notion of you go in and get the mitochondria working again, because it isn't working, and amazing things happen as soon as that happens, and that happens immediately.
So is this a substitute for working with a veterinarian, or is this something that is complementary to?
I think it's absolutely complementary. The vets don't necessarily think that, and we're trying to convince them that we don't want to take their business away. The fact that we can do things that maybe avoids the surgery, they should embrace that. They shouldn't fight that. But when they do have a surgery, and they're necessary sometimes, I mean, they can be necessary, then the post-op is perfect for us. I mean, we can get the thing healed up much quicker, no chance of infection, lesser chance of re-injury before you get healed. And we're trying to convince them that that's how we'd like to work with them. Most of them don't want to bring the technology into the place. They don't want to either learn it or have the ability to really do that. So send them to us. I mean, that's what we want them to do.
So since this is a new process using older technology, how do you try to educate the general population about the benefits of pet-like therapy?
Well, again, as I said, I wish I would have figured out the animal stuff about a lot of years sooner, because the videos, you can't fake it. I mean, Bob, we actually did hire him in Hollywood. Are we going to show Bob here at some point?
Yes, I understand we have a video to show of Bob the Wonder Dog.
This dog is famous. I mean, he's well known. I mean, we do a lot of work in Asia also, and he's well known over there. He's known everywhere.
This is Bob the Chihuahua. As you can see, Bob has lost functionality in his rear legs. Rachel, Bob's owner, could not recall any injury or provocation prior to the onset of these symptoms. After taking Bob to a number of veterinarians and ultimately to a veterinary neurologist, Bob's owner was told that he needed an MRI and back surgery immediately. The neurologist further admonished that if Rachel declined to proceed with surgical intervention, that she should euthanize Bob there and then. I met Bob for the first time for a second opinion. This video was taken just prior to our initial evaluation.
Initial visual assessment.
The healing solution formulated for Bob included neuromyofascial release therapy and a new cutting-edge light therapy technology called Pet Light.
That's definitely better. Keep going. Hey, Bob.
Sweetie. Sit, good boy. Yeah,
Can you walk again for me?
yeah, come on.
Okay, so here is a case where, the diagnosis could not have been correct. I mean, it only took us 4 treatments. The dog's 100% back to normal. So surgery was never needed. And those are just the sorts of things that we like to see prevented, not get there. Same thing with humans, really. I mean, we've done a lot of work with all kinds of injuries in sporting athletes, football. My chief medical officer's a 49er team doctor. So again, we're trying to maybe be the first alternative. And if we don't work, then you can do all the other stuff you were going to do, but we generally do work. So
if Western medicine is practitioners using surgery and the administration of chemicals, prescription drugs and the like, and Eastern medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, is more of treating the whole body and looking at the energy flow, where would this fit within those two?
This is where East meets West. I mean, right at the crossroads. We're doing a lot over in Taiwan right now. Matter of fact, one of the first machines we sold was to the Chi Master of Taiwan. He's famous for being the guy. We've bought 2 machines so far. His mother got a hold of one of them and wouldn't give it back. So, anyway, he also is the head of their stock exchange. So now all his guys that are working for him are buying them because they're doing their brains and they feel more focused. So I mean, there's all kinds of ways to use this system, and it's really about that, right? We don't really do anything. All we do is put energy into the body where it needs it, and the body knows what to do. So instead of tricking with a drug saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with you, which works great right up until you die, we put the energy in, let healing take place, but we're not really doing that. Energy's doing that.
And what future developments do you see in the next 1 to 5 years?
We've got all kinds of new patents coming down the road. We've got a whole new drive system. You know, back in 2012, I merged with a company, or not a company, a guy by the name of Richard Williams, who had a company called Analogic. And they made all of the drivers for the TV industry. So he's got over 400 patents on how to drive LEDs himself, right? Well, that's all we do is drive LEDs, and we've got a whole new thing coming. We're not going to talk about that right now, because maybe we'll get Richard on this show one of these days, and we'll talk about it when all the patents are due.
We'll take you up on that.
Okay.
Well, fascinating technology. It sounds like you're making a lot of animals happy.
We are.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
No, my
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
My pleasure.
All right. Our next guest is Corey Brier, author of The Habitual Hustler. Corey is an author of several different works, including his own blog, and he is going to talk to us about the process of innovation in writing his book. Interesting book. Tell us a little bit about it, and welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me. So, The Habitual Hustler started about 2 years ago when I lost my job and my girlfriend in the same week. I suddenly had a lot of time on my hands, and I'd always thought of myself as an effective person who could get things done. But I found that when I didn't have anything that I needed to do, it was tough to be effective, and I found myself sleeping in and wasting time. There's a lot of people out there who are able to be effective on their own time. With the rise of the internet and Web 2.0 and all those kinds of things, you see self-employment as a rising trend, and you see people who are able to get things done without a boss. And so the question that I wanted to ask was, what does a successful day look like when it's lived on your own terms? And so I set out to interview about 50 people in the space and tried to get a map of what that looked like.
Well, let me stop you there for a minute, because it's interesting to me, the process of inspiration which created the idea in your mind to actually write a book about that. How did that spark occur to you?
So there were 3 reasons that I decided to go through this project. One was writing the book that I wanted to read. This was a space in the industry that I hadn't seen. There was a lot of books about habits of corporate strategies, and there were a lot of books on how to become self-employed, how to design your lifestyle, but there was nothing that talked about what a day looked like after it had been achieved through self-employment. And so that was a gap in the market. It was the book that I wanted to read, and then I thought that it'd be a good way to make relationships with my personal heroes. So for me, it was a no-brainer. Maybe it was partly just being involved with these people's works. They're all very go-getter, like you can do it type of philosophy, and so I decided to put it into practice and something to do to fill my days as well while I was unemployed, looking for something else.
So you grew up in Silicon Valley, and you now live in San Francisco. It's the twin hearts of the technology economy these days. How did you go about selecting people to interview, and what was the process of contacting them and talking them into being interviewed?
Mm-hmm. So I started off with a wish list that was just a rough wish list of who I thought should be in the book, based off of my personal interest in lifestyle design and self-development type industry. As I interviewed them, a lot of them would give referrals to other people who they thought should be in the book. I would ask them as one of the interview questions, who should be in this book? Whose habits do you want to know about? I also designed a rough criteria around self-employed people with public bodies of work that dealt with self-development. So in this way, the reader could learn about all these habits and also dig into these people's works in order to learn more about self-development. As for contacting them, this was probably one of the most useful parts of the project, was having to get in touch with these busy people and convince them I was worth their time. That's always a good skill to have. It was much easier than I expected. Cold email goes a long way. Any salesperson can tell you. There were a couple strategies I used in order to make sure that I got a response. Persistence is obviously one of them. I also used warm referrals whenever possible. If I knew that one of these guys had a blog post, guest blog post with another one, then I would use them to get a warm intro. That definitely improved it. But honestly, most of it was cold email, intelligently written in a way that proved I was worth their time and that this was a project that they should be a part of.
And in the course of interviewing 50 people, which I'm sure took you some period of time, some were more interesting than others, I'm sure.
Yep.
Can you tell us some anecdotes of some of the more interesting things that you learned and some of the more interesting people you talked to?
So you want to hear the fun facts or the useful overall commonalities?
Let's go with fun facts.
Okay, so there's some crazy ones out there. You get into the power of now, Eckhart Tolle type stuff. Incantations was one that showed up a couple times. So there'd be people who, before any important meeting, they'd go, power pose in the bathroom or yell at themselves in the mirror and say how great they were.
That's what you were doing before the
That's
show.
a good one. Yep, it's a good strategy. Another guy would schedule a tweet with a link to his PayPal account every morning at 6 a.m. And if he didn't wake up and schedule that tweet for the next day, people could click on the tweet and get money from his PayPal account. So it's a pretty high-tech solution to an early morning alarm, but it worked for him. I think the standout one was this one man who wanted to subconsciously devalue money. And so he took out $100 in $1 bills and slowly fed them into a fire while repeating to himself that money is not important. And so he was definitely on the extreme end of the hustlers. Most people do not have habits like that, but it was something that came up in talking about his day that is undoubtedly a fun fact.
It's like the opposite of making it rain.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of the useful tips that you learned over the course of these interviews.
So after about 50 of these, you started to see some trends. You started to see some commonalities. There are some questions that I would ask and pretty much know the answer beforehand. I'd say the biggest one is mindfulness, a habit of meditation and reflection. When you're self-employed especially, you are the only one who's looking back on your work. You don't have someone reviewing what you're doing. So it's very important to, A, look back on what you're doing to make sure it aligns with what you're trying to do, and B, just be in the moment and appreciate it, right? Because it's easy to overwork yourself if you're the only person that you report to. So I'd say meditation and mindfulness was one of the biggest ones. Creative mornings and manager afternoons was another big one. When you're self-employed, again, you don't have a boss, no one's managing you except for yourself. But the management process is not helpful to the creative process. The creative process is something that requires hours of uninterruption. You have to get in the flow, you have to lose yourself. Whereas the managerial process, if you look at a lot of managers, their day is just in hour-long chunks, and they just fill those chunks. So a lot of these hustlers would do creative work in the morning and then do email and admin tasks in the afternoon. So I thought that was an interesting one. Beyond that, sleep and health was a priority, exercise. If your mind is your greatest instrument, you got to make sure it's well oiled, body, mind stuff, all that kind of thing. And then just writing down what they did. So a lot of them, the night before the next day, they would write down what the one thing they wanted to do tomorrow was, assuming that that was the only thing that they achieved that day. What would be the thing that would make them go to bed happy? And then they would know they would have that priority for the next day. And at the end of the day, they'd write down what they did. And so you just have this system of record for whether you're actually productive or not.
Did any of the tips that you learned help you in the process of writing your book, the discipline that it takes to put together a body of work that encompasses 50 interviews?
Somewhat. I definitely picked up a couple of the habits while doing it. I have a daily meditation practice as well. I had weekly goals. I wasn't very strict about it. Again, I guess it was an exercise in self-employment because no one told me to write this book. I was just doing it for myself and for the world that I thought could find value in it. I had goals of, an interview a week at least, making sure to have a fast turnaround from turning the interview into something publishable. But I'd say it was less habits applied to the process and more habits just for general life. So the daily meditation practice, being aware of when you're creative and when you're admin, breaking up that work, maybe not doing email first thing in the morning. Those are habits I picked up. I'm not sure if they're specifically useful for the book writing process, though.
Well, you've become quite an author. I've followed your blog, which is always interesting, and you also have another book, Life is a Game, Group Games for Kids, Teens, and Adults.
Yeah.
That's a book. Just give us a quick overview of that book.
So that was my first book, co-wrote it with my family. That one was oriented towards answering the question of what should you do with your friends that doesn't involve a screen. We all have phones every day. We're all staring at them. It's sometimes tough to figure out what to do with your buddies if it doesn't involve a phone. And so my family's a very playful family, you know that. And so we decided to gather up all these games that we had discovered over the years, kind of like campground games, local multiplayer games, even if it was a video game, or like games that need no materials, improv games, that kind of stuff, and put them in one database. So you could have this book, and if you didn't know what to do, you could look at it and get some ideas. So we kickstarted that, we crowdfunded it, got $5,000. It was pretty successful, even though it was all our friends who were backing us. I'm sure maybe you were a backer on that. And so that was another good experience. It definitely probably was a factor in the Habitual Hustler later on. I knew that I could do this. I knew that self-publishing was a thing. So it was a valuable experience, I'd say.
And both books are now available on Amazon?
Yes. So habitualhustler.com will link you to Amazon. You can buy it there. It's an ebook. It'll be a physical book soon by the end of the year. And then Life is a Game is at 101groupgames.com. It can also link you straight to Amazon. And that's a physical book. So.
And we'll give a special shout out to Riley, who's the sheriff in our games.
There you go. Yeah, you've played some games. That was one of them, and my little brother was usually the sheriff. So
very good. Our habitual hustler, Corey Brier, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our show. This is Global Innovation. I am your host, Chris Graham. Thank you.